So you're exactly right that it makes it really tricky because that's already one constraint where you say, okay, well, shrink the time window, shrink your sprints, and it's like, well, we can't finish work. It's not done until we have seen it as far out as we can and go, like, there's no possibility at this point it's going to break. Hey, I'm Nick.
And I'm Graeme.
And this is the Dude, Where's My Code podcast. And this is episode number 4 of season 2. Graeme, you and I were just chatting about a similar thing that we talked about the time before. And we were looking at some agile sort of methodologies in terms of what that looks like, perhaps at a different size or different type of team and company. So just a little bit of contrast compared to what we're used to, I guess.
Yeah, I took the chance to turn the tables a little bit and put the spotlight on you and see how you're applying some of the stuff that we talk about into kind of the larger, Microsoft type context that you live in.
Yeah, for sure. So I think really interesting conversation to go between this episode and the one before. So if folks haven't watched or listened to the one before, I think that's a good primer going into this one. But I think you'll love the conversation. Do us a favor, like the video, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Enjoy.
Yeah. I switched up a few things. Okay, well, let's just charge ahead.
Cool.
So, last week we were talking about agile processes and what it means to actually be agile and think about what kinds of frameworks are actually in support of how you want to run a team and the engineering and delivery values that you kind of subscribe to. And I guess at the end there, I didn't get a chance to kind of turn the tables a little bit and ask. We talk a lot about my engineering group of 7 people, and I think it's pretty easy to be able to wax poetic about just doing what works when you're a team of 7 people and really
Sure.
just being flexible. And I know your environment is much different, and I'm curious kind of how you take what we've talked about and apply it in kind of a much larger, much more potentially structured environment that I think you're in.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, for context as well, obviously you and I have worked together in small teams. So what I'll be sharing, some of it's not necessarily like what I view as ideal. If I had ultimate control and choice and could influence my environment in all ways, I'd probably change things to help make things feel more agile, if I can maybe frame it that way. But some of it's just the constraints of being in a larger organization. So as I go into some of these details, some of it is not how I view necessarily ideal operations for a team, but like I said, it's more about kind of operating within some of these different constraints that I'm used to.
I think it's important to know that there are times when there are constraints, and figuring out how you can apply kind of the things we're talking about, the practices that we're talking about in different environments, I think has value to it. Before you talk about that, when we were together on kind of a smaller engineering team and organization, I'm trying to remember, I feel like we had a fair amount of autonomy of the way we worked, and I don't remember if that ever changed as the company grew and structure was put in place, or if we kind of were always making decisions about the way we were going to work.
Yeah, I think for the most part, I would say we had a lot of autonomy when we were working together in a smaller team. I think some of the biggest changes I don't feel were the result of the company growing necessarily, but more of the stage of the product.
Right.
So something that I can remember, and I don't want this to sound like it was a bad thing necessarily, but when we were working on mobile acquisition product, so we were working on what was called Magnet Acquire, that started off as very much like a, very, very agile early stage. Like it was a prototype. A lot of it was whipped up pretty early.
It was pretty engineering led. I don't think it necessarily started with a strong set of requirements. That was a problem to be solved, and we kind of set out to solve it. And then from there, I think there was product iteration around what would make this product better and more usable. But in the beginning, it was like, solve this problem.
Yeah, well, exactly, right. So I can remember in the very early stages, like from being on previous teams, it was like, well, we're like, what do we do about Jira and tracking stories and stuff? And it was like, we don't. Like it's already way overkill at that point in the life cycle of the product to even try it. Like you would spend more time trying to track and create stories and organize them in Jira or whatever you wanted to use, then you would just rapidly iterate on things and being like, can we take a step forward? Like that's how early it was.
Mm-hmm.
And then we moved on to being like, okay, like we're not just constantly writing stuff and throwing it away. Like it's starting to stick. And all of a sudden, like, okay, like we talked about this idea, maybe we should at least write that down. And like a backlog starts to form where we're starting to have more ideas we want to explore than we can crank out just by literally hacking code in a small room. But it grew from there even, right? Because it was like, okay, start to document the ideas. And then it started to be like, hey, look, like this could be a real thing. And we had a UX designer come in and start saying, well, okay, if we're going to build this, like here's maybe how we want to have people using it.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember even for me, obviously not compared to maybe some other things at Magnet Forensics, but for that particular product, like that UX designer coming in was like the most amount of structure. Like it almost felt like hitting a wall. And I know this sounds bad, but there's a happy ending to it. But going from, trying to just iterate as fast as possible to being like, hold on, you have to make it look a certain way. It was like, whoa, like now we can only go at like 30% of the speed. Like, what do you mean it has to look this way? But what was cool about that interaction, and the reason I say there's a happy ending to it, is like we started to work with the UX designer to come up with a lot of like, what's a good way to frame it? Like the usability in general, like almost like a usability architecture, if I could call it that. I'm sure people in UX have better words for it, but we had really good conversations about this is the direction we want to go in. And sometimes it was framed up for us, like make it look this way, make it feel this way. And we'd push back and be like, no, that's so much work. Like we'll take one step in this direction. And the UX designer was like, awesome, perfect. Just do that then.
Mm-hmm.
And it was this really cool interaction where it was like, okay, like you asked for all this stuff and we said, we'll take one tiny step in that direction and you're okay with it. Like seems suspicious, but okay. And then we would do it and some of the UX design would change. We'd get the feedback and it was like, well, good thing we didn't go build all of that because it was wrong. And some of it would stick where it's like, oh, we realized that people do find it more usable to follow these patterns. So as we would push forward and design more things, build more of the product, it was like, yeah, try to focus on these patterns. They seem to be proving to work pretty well. So it was just a really cool evolution of adding in some processes and some structure from something that started with like literally the absolute minimum. Like, I don't even know how we built it in the first place. Probably not with a build system for sure.
Oh yeah, no, it was here's the exe from my bin folder and like it's on the shared drive now. You can go.
Yeah, like, whenever you want to go run it, it's there.
That was before. That was even before it was like packaged in an installer or anything. It was it was rough. By design, there was only like 2 to 3 people working on it at a given time. So yeah. I also seem to recall. I mean, 2 things about that. One, we gave that product away for free, so we did fall into that same kind of space of being able to say, look, like we're going to put this out, and it effectively beta test it through like a free launch, which did afford us some of the luxuries of like, well, obviously we don't want it to look like crap, but it didn't necessarily have to have the most polished UX because we were using some of that early free feedback to help us understand how people would use the tool and if it
was a great point
work. Yeah. So the other thing was that I do seem to recall at some point with multiple projects, there was Acquire and there was others where as they got more mature, we ended up having project managers kind of come on board and get involved. And best I can remember from that, every experience that I can recall, a project manager joined, and the first thing that happened was like, "Hey, here's the way we're working." And for at least some amount of time, they were really doing more of a scrum master type role, like trying to wrangle the dependencies and trying to like go make sure the team was unblocked by getting the right things moving at the right time, and like really learning the kind of metrics we were tracking through our agile processes, and starting to like get behind improving the way we reported that and the way we discussed it in like planning and retro meetings. And so I think that's a really cool example of a time where it was very team led. And then as support roles came on to kind of help the team, it wasn't what I have seen other examples of, which is, hey, here's your project manager, and they have thoughts about how this project is going to run from now on. So time to do that. It was very much like they're here to enable and assist in continuing with on the effectiveness that we were kind of already on.
Yeah, and like I would love to sit back and just take credit for being like, oh, it's just because we obviously worked so well and came up with the perfect, like, I'm not going to pretend like that's just not reality. I don't want to say that we just got lucky either, but I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that when we're creating software, we're also iterating on just what's working for us and being aware. So when it came time for like more support roles and stuff to come in, it wasn't like, hey, we're adding this support role because it's pretty obvious that like you're falling apart and they're brought in to fix it. Like, I don't think that was an expectation of any support role that was ever added. It was, hey, this looks like it's going well. Again, I'm not trying to say just because we're perfect at it or something, but it looks like it's going well. It looks like you're starting to run into some potential challenges, or we're foreseeing that they might, just based on the rate things are going. So let's bring in some support roles to, almost like ahead of time, or at least reactive enough where it's not, oh, like an oh crap moment, now we're in trouble, get them to fix it kind of thing.
Right. Cool. Okay, so
things are different now. But yeah, no, it's a completely different framing from a lot of what I'm used to, even aside from Acquire, right? Like being at Magnet and being there early on, a lot of the time I want to say the luxury, but also it's not necessarily a luxury of being in early on a particular product and being like, okay, like a lot of what I did was prototype things in the beginning, get them off the ground. Like the Acquire group of people, that was effectively a prototyping team.
Right.
So a lot of my time in my professional career has been prototyping things, getting them to a point where they become a real product, and either that team continues to grow and manage it, or it gets passed off and absorbed into something else, or other teams are spun up to sort of take over that. So I've had a lot of experience doing that and doing that on repeat, but that looks one particular way, and every time it's a little bit different. Of course, it's never going to be exactly the same, but similar, right? You start with very little structure. You kind of take on at least the minimum amount of pieces that seem like they fit and just kind of try to evolve as you're going. But coming to Microsoft has been very different, and for a handful of different reasons. Like, number one, I'm not coding the things anymore. So that's a big part. And number two, I'm joining into teams that have well-established things. I've joked around that like some of the stuff that we support is older than people on the team. Like,
yeah, right.
And versus like, hey, we just made this last week, like, come on and help us. It's like, no, this has been around for a very long time. So, like those two things alone are very, very different. But then you layer on some other things, right? Like, for example, working in deployment. I've just switched teams, but I'm going to be talking about deployment to start with. Deployment is a huge platform area within M365, right? So there's a responsibility to be deploying like hundreds of services for different teams. So as a platform team, like that's also a difference for me, which means we have many different partners we have to support. Whereas again, at Magnet, it would have been very different. Like we weren't The scale was, of course, very different, but it was almost like the surface area that you'd be interacting with, even if you were like working on platform pieces. It's not like hundreds of teams, it's 3 teams or something. Just a lot smaller surface area that way. And then the other sort of dimension I want to add in is that the pace is slower, and I want to be careful about how I say that, because I don't want to say like, oh, it's just because we're innovating less or we're doing less important work or something like that. It's not the case. I just mean that the way that it could have worked before at Magnet is we'd make changes. You could push up multiple features in a day, have them built out, see the result, like, within an hour, even at some of like the slowest times that we had, and be iterating, right? Getting feedback, working with, testing partners if you were an engineer, working with product owners if you were an engineer, very quickly. And in deployment, we purposefully have like slower rollout strategies to be safe. And not only that, the build system is significantly bigger. We're talking about, again, deploying like monolithic software, at least for our core infrastructure. The partner services would, a lot of them are microservices we're deploying, but deployment itself is not structured that way. So seeing changes and us being able to iterate as a platform team just looked extremely different compared to what I'm used to. So those are a lot of different constraints that have to shape how we operate.
I think one of the things you've mentioned before is one of those constraints is because of the time it takes for changes to go out and roll out, and they kind of need to be like maybe not necessarily micromanaged, but until it's out, it's not necessarily done. And so that like time to done is much longer. And if you try to do something like, hey, we're going to do something new, team, we're going to do 1 week long sprints. Like the problem is, hey, like we kind of can't wrap a ticket up and consider it closed in that time frame. So how do you even operate in that? So certainly I can imagine some of the way you work is dictated by the reality of how long you have to spend focused on a specific task before you can even consider it done in the best of times.
Totally, right. And I think if we think back to, I mean, I know you've worked at other places aside from Magnet, but I think about making desktop software at Magnet for the most part, and being in a situation where it's like, okay, if we want to shrink that cycle time, like we can shrink, we do things to focus on getting our end-to-end time reduced so that we can play with other variables and things like that. But like, I don't, in deployment, even if I could snap my fingers and make a build of our infrastructure go instantly. If I could do that, I still have a bake time and we have different rings that we deploy out to. So I would have a bake time at these different rings. So one could argue that you would get a signal where you might feel good enough. Again, if I could snap my fingers, within a day, you could have a good signal. But what's good? Like good by us in deployment, our standards, because we're confident about what we're building as a platform. But we have multiple rings and they're scoped from being like internal to engineering in Office 365, out to Microsoft, out to partners. There's different levels of environments that are not necessarily multi-tenant, so like you have to be extra careful. And there's all these different gates in place to make sure that you can't accidentally press a button and then have a blast radius that's very big. So even if we could snap our fingers and make certain parts go faster, the organization as a whole prohibits it. And yes, in deployment, we have some say about, like, here's how fast we physically can go if we were allowed to. So we can move at the speed of light. And we obviously want to keep moving towards as fast as we can go. But it doesn't mean that we're allowed to go that fast based on the organization's comfort. So you're exactly right that it makes it really tricky because that's already one constraint where you say, okay, well, shrink the time window, shrink your sprints, and it's like, well, we can't finish work. It's not done until we have seen it as far out as we can and go, like, there's no possibility at this point it's going to break.
So similarly, you're not going to go and implement a Kanban model with like really low WIP limits where, hey, I don't want more than a certain number of things in progress. I mean,
Right.
that number would have to be high to be able to say we're okay with a bunch of stuff like baking, recognizing that it might come back if something goes wrong or is not on the happy path.
Totally. And it's a weird problem to have compared to where I've been before, because the challenge was almost the opposite to what I've ever faced. It's been like, how do we reduce WIP limits to get people to collaborate and work on more things in work on fewer number of things in parallel because we're working together on those things. And the inverse is now the case where it's like, I have 5 things that I'm flighting out and waiting to get, feedback and data on. What's the next thing that I can do? So how do you do that while not siloing people completely because everyone's working on like a very disparate number of things?
You're kind of optimizing for filling time with as many things as you can without doing that in such a way that it blocks you from like delivering with quality, right?
Yeah, and that becomes tricky too because, like, again, it's based on the constraints. It's all of these, it's like almost like opposite problems that we're used to trying to solve for when we're trying to be more agile and nimble. I should say agile with air quotes. Yeah, like, okay, what's the next priority? It's like, okay, well, I mean, there's always stuff to do. There's always partners that we could be helping, improving relationships with, potential bugs or legacy things. Like, again, it's a very old system we're supporting. There's always new work that we could be innovating on. But then you start to touch some of that stuff, and we all know the more things you have in parallel, okay, one of those things you get a signal back and it's not okay. All right, now you context switch, right? So you have context switching even in your happy path where there's a lot of overhead for that. And then you layer on the fact that, of course, not everything's going to go perfect. So now you're context switching to fix things. And the result of that is that, like, how do you maximize your effective time on things while being able to pivot and not have a waste of time from the context switching, which is challenging.
Mm-hmm. Have you had a chance in your time with that team to look at your team's processes and the way you work as a team and look for opportunities to like change and tweak that process? And if you have, like, what kinds of things do you like look at, or what can you change that maybe helps you work in that environment?
Yeah, not in the traditional sense that I'm used to doing, and mostly because of the constraints that are kind of in front of us. But the things that I want to be able to try and optimize for, because I go back to the constraint is that a particular piece of work, even on the happy path, is going to take X amount of time at a minimum.
Right.
So if I have that as a constraint, the other things that I'd like to optimize for are things like collaboration, knowledge sharing, building things together so that you're not like, I spent a week on a pull, like getting code ready for a pull request, and then someone finally reviews it and they're like, what the heck is this? Like, do it again. Like, those are types of things that we can try to optimize for. So I tried spending more time focusing on that kind of stuff where it's like, okay, an incident's happened, or we had even not an incident, but you pushed a change forward and realized something didn't go right. Okay, like, what can we learn? Like, how can we get the knowledge sharing in? How could we look at work items that can be done in parallel? So we have a particular scope of work and there's many pieces to it that we can split up. So I had some projects that worked really well like that. I like to think they work well because you still have the constraint of each one of these pieces takes a while to finally get through.
Mm.
But when you have a handful of people working on them together, it's almost like you get this pipeline going where people are learning from each other because the type of work is similar, right? They know how to review the pull request properly. They're aware of the types of changes and issues they should be looking for, how to test, how to flight. So it's almost like by working together week over week, iteration over iteration on these similar items, they continue to become more efficient. So finding things like that, I think, was probably the best type of optimization that we could introduce.
What is like I feel like I've been operating with a sense or an assumption about the way the team works in terms of you'll have an initiative or a project that you're trying to accomplish, even if the whole team is working on it. There's presumably some process of like, what do we technically have to deliver for this? And how do we break that down? And how do engineers know what to pick up next and what to work on? Is it like, is it some form of Scrum or Kanban, or is it none of that and it's something else? I'm like, I don't know if I have an accurate picture.
It's a good question. I don't know. I don't even want to try to label it like Scrum or Kanban, but if I kind of zoom out and just look at overall what things look like. So we approach planning in terms of like semester planning. So for us, I don't want to necessarily list out details, but it's on multiple month kind of cadence where
Mm-hmm.
we're projecting out things we have to build. And I'm of the mindset where, like, as soon as we're talking about multiple months out, I just recognize like it's not accurate. It doesn't matter. It's going to change. Are there high level goals and things we want to focus on? Absolutely. Will those mostly stay consistent? Yes, but is it guaranteed to change? Yes. So we start that way, and the way that we frame some of that up is that we have ideally, and this is where it gets kind of tricky, right? Ideally, we have things that the team is coming up with, being a platform team, a lot of engineering effort, like things that we know we can improve on. So whether it's not necessarily just tech debt, but like, sure, might be some tech debt. It might be, hey, architecturally, we think we have some ideas about how to improve this, because each part of the deployment team, these different feature crews, they have different sort of charters. So the feature crew that I had was focused on downtime when we're deploying. So how can we deploy if we take the context of one machine, how can we go as fast as possible on that one machine? Like, that was our charter. So we would try to come up with ways that were innovative to be able to do that faster, or to measure more accurately, things like that. We had other parts of our charter, but we would try to introduce concepts like that. And then you layer in, okay, well, how do we support our other feature crews within deployment? Then layer in, how do we support our partner requests? Because again, Microsoft scale, we're not even talking Microsoft scale. We're talking about just like Microsoft 365. So one part of Microsoft.
Yeah.
But you have these teams that they're also platform teams, and they might say, hey, we're deprecating X. And you have, 50 teams that are using X. Like, okay, like you're one of those teams. You have a timeline that you have to contribute towards that. Or we're introducing a new thing, or we're shifting. Like, so you have all these other initiatives that you have to try and layer in as well.
Right.
So we do that at like a high level planning period. And it's OKRs for us, right? So objectives and key results. And again, in the ideal sense, we're coming up with our own from our feature crews and deployment perspective. And then from the other direction, layering in organizational and higher level business objectives and trying to mesh them together. But that's the beginning of what this looks like. Does that check out, or any questions?
Totally.
Okay,
Makes sense.
So yeah, we'd start that way, and then from there we go. At least, so for me as a manager, at that point, I'm trying to have conversations with individuals on the team to be like, okay, well, like your strengths, weaknesses, career aspirations, coupled with these things we have coming up. So trying to have those conversations about it might be that something's super critical and I need to make sure that I can try to get someone with a lot of expertise to start tackling that right away, given timelines or just the severity of it. It might be that some things have looser timelines and they happen to be really aligned with people's career aspirations. So especially in the beginning of a semester, I can lean into that and make sure they have opportunities. But it's definitely a balancing act at that stage. But the ultimately I'm trying to balance the business priorities with those things. So if I know that if we have a semester, if some of those things have to be finished early in the semester to unblock other teams and make progress, those things need attention right away. So making sure that I'm not just saying, hey, you have X number of months to go get all this done and we'll just hope that it happens.
Right.
It might be that like, okay, we know in the next month we have to be like most of the way through this part of the project. So whoever's working on this one, let's make sure that we're kind of getting ahead of the curve on that. But from there, that's where we, depending on what the project is, go into things like design documents. Sometimes like the design docs, and depending on what the project is, like that happens even before it's committed in a semester. It can largely depend on how big the effort is, how many teams are involved. But a lot of the time we try to get ahead of that because, I mean, if we know that we want to finish it within a semester versus we know it's a multi-semester effort, like if it's multi-semester effort, we might just start planning it mid-semester and saying like, it is what it is. But otherwise, we might try to get ahead of it and say, let's get designs in place or at least have these upfront conversations so we know that we can get ideally most of the way, if not the whole way through once we start. But again, a lot of that's getting ourselves set up so that we can start to iterate with sprints once the semester starts.
Okay. So you are kind of doing some semblance of sprints once you have committed work in front of you. You're trying to deliver things in like chunks, I guess, or themes, or however you want to kind of frame it.
Yeah, for the most part. And I honestly, like in these situations, I look at the sprint boundaries mostly like a ceremonial checkpoint. I want to try pushing for continuous improvement in the team. Like what did we do over the past 2 weeks? We still tried to do. I guess we did like a month long sprint, just given the nature of the work. So we do a month long sprint and we try to talk about like things we could improve. I think that was challenging, and I think it could have been more feedback if we did it every 2 weeks on the team kind of improvements. It's just a gut feel, so I think that could have been changed. Otherwise, it's kind of like, well, we said we were going to try this a month ago. Like, did we stick to it? I don't know.
Right.
But yeah, then we would kind of use again like that month boundary to be like, I mean, we're doing sync ups weekly, but using the month boundary to be like, hey, wait, like we're a month in now, we're on track, or if not, like, what are we doing to kind of realign?
Right. Potentially shifting priorities, and then also just reviewing how the team is working. Is there team norms you want to change around collaboration or
right.
delivery? Okay.
And of course, like there were other priorities that would come up very frequently, even before that month boundary, right? There'd be stuff where it's like, look, like I know we just started this sprint and we're a week in for the month, and like something's come up, like, and having the conversation with the team about this being a priority for some reason. Sometimes it was missed planning, right? Where we'd have a team that would reach out and say like, what's your guys' plan for committing to this in this semester? And we'd say like, we haven't even heard of this. And then we would go, uh-oh, like, so like, tell us, like, how serious is this for you guys to have it wrapped up in this semester? And then we would have a, healthy conversation back and forth, like, hey, this is a initiative from leadership. We don't know how we missed it with your team, but like they're expecting it. So we go back to the drawing board and say, okay, can we drop off our lowest priority commitment, or do we push back on them and say like, look, like this is a miss. Like we if we have time in this semester, we'll try, but odds are no. Or maybe we can do the design in this semester so you can go back to leadership and say, look, it's like it's a miss, but there's a plan. And a lot of the time, having at least a plan and some type of rough timeline was, that would work well, and people wouldn't be totally upset.
All right, interesting.
But yeah, very, very different in terms of like time horizons and things like that, I would say, like compared to what I'm used to.
And like high levels of like dependencies on other teams. And I suspect that's where a lot of the upfront planning comes from is, hey, we know this is going to affect so many other teams that we all have to be thinking ahead about it. So we know what our piece is and how we can make sure it gets delivered. We're not doing this serially, so every team does their piece, and 2 years later, this thing that we wanted to happen has finally come together. So
that's the biggest part, I would say, is exactly as you framed it, right? Like the fact that some of these initiatives were dealing with so many teams. If you're not doing some amount of upfront work, it just becomes it's already chaotic when you have a lot of people working on stuff, but when no one's planning it ahead of time.
Yeah.
It's and for total transparency, I'm not super big on a lot of upfront planning because I just feel like at some point it becomes wasteful. But I like going into a lot of these, I'm like, doing none that's like a disaster waiting to happen. So finding that right balance of let's do enough where we're at least aligned on the initial steps and the direction we want to go in. I think sometimes once we start getting into like really specific API specs and things like that, I'm like, it's going to change. Like at some point it starts to be a little bit wasteful, but I think the conversations in general are still helpful.
Right.
So that's been my history at Microsoft for the most part, but I've just switched to this new team and they have sort of different constraints around delivery vehicles, I guess. And some of the projects there's a couple of projects that are completely brand new. So just like there's a lot of design and conversations and stuff happening for some of those. And for other ones, I think it's a lot more understood. And it's really just about taking iterative steps to like chip away at them. So I suspect that I'll start to see some similarities to prior to joining Microsoft.
Is there there's less dependencies there and more opportunity to like maybe shift about how you are delivering because it's not going to affect so many people? Or
yeah, I think for a couple of the projects it's exactly that, and for the one bigger project that's a little bit more unknown that technically has other partners that are involved, but because it's greenfield for the most part, it's kind of cool actually. Like they're also in this position where they're like, hey, we're getting aligned on the direction we want to go in, and once we feel aligned on the direction, like let's all just jump in and iterate like this. It's a cool conversation about like in terms of ownership. It's like it's not really there. You might have some ownership over some of the design areas, and that's not to say that like you don't include people. It's just that you're going to be responsible for trying to lead some of the direction there. And then once that's agreed upon, it's like cool. Like we're all going to be chipping in to tackle it. Like, and it's cross team. It's cross Microsoft actually, which is really awesome.
Cool. So we'll have this conversation again in a few months.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping something like that would come up, and it would be cool to see like how that's evolved. Because it's so I'm looking at my calendar. It's been 3 days on this team, so very early, but this is kind of the vibe that I'm picking up so far.
Sweet.
Yeah.
All right. I guess is there takeaways for people who are in a similar position and they're saying, hey, I'm someone who has worked on smaller teams and suddenly I'm finding myself in some of these new environments, bigger environments. I've got more constraints on me. I don't know how to navigate having less freedom and still trying to focus inward on my team and be constantly like improving as a team. Do you have any like takeaways or actions for what a leader in that position might do?
Yeah, I feel like, and I don't want this to be like super generic, but I think it comes down to thinking about what your constraints are, acknowledging them, right? Some things might seem like constraints and they're just because that's the way things are right now, but that doesn't mean that they can't be, you know, and you've experienced this, right? Where it's like, hey, like that's just how we do things. And it's like, but why? Right. And like, I think it's good to be able to challenge those things. So I don't want to discourage people and say like, oh, it's a constraint, you better shut up and just live with it. It's like, no, like I think it's good to question. So for us in deployment, it's like if there's a lot of red lighting in place, like could we not be trying to green light more? Like could we be shifting more to that paradigm where it's less about bake time and saying like we have green signals that are going, like if it's green, go. So like that's a bit of a paradigm shift that's been coming up more and more, which I think is super cool. So, you know, just because it is the way it is right now doesn't mean it always has to be that way. So part of me would say like think about your constraints, because some things you cannot control and other things you might be able to influence. So have a look at that. And then for the things that you can influence, either like the example I was giving, where if you're doing a paradigm shift, that's one part. But even for the things that don't need a paradigm shift, like think about what's in your control and what you can be optimizing for. So the example that I provided earlier for the one team I have was like, I want to make sure people are collaborating on things, right? I know that if they have to work on multiple things in parallel, just given the sort of the turnaround time for getting features landed, I still want to try and bring people together so that they can collaborate on design. They can split up work and kind of get into this mode of like, we have a pipeline system going to churn through it. Like there's just a lot of benefit I see in doing that. So again, just looking at what you have influence over and the sort of the positive qualities you want to try and optimize for. So like I said, I know it sounds a little bit generic, but I think if you step back and look at those pieces, don't try to do them all at once, but try to see like, what can I try to chip away at and drive improvements incrementally.
Yeah. All right.
Then just snap your fingers and make it happen, right?
Yeah.
That's how it works.
Perfect.
But yeah.
Well, I mean, that's helpful. I know I spend a lot of time living in this like small team world, and it's so nice to hear that, you know, even in a world of big, well-established, long-standing companies, there is modern practices taking place, and there's opportunity to introspect on that and figure out how to tweak and tune, and that there's still people doing that.
Yeah, and I would like to do more of it. So if I reflect on my time on the previous team, I think in one of our previous conversations, I was telling you I probably lean too much on let me just sit back and be more passive about having the team make changes and stuff. But I probably should have leaned a little bit more into, hey, like let me try to shake things up a little bit after some time, and not because I thought the team was doing poorly or anything, but because I had an opportunity where I probably could have pushed a little more to see if we could get some extra, you know, enhancements out of the team. So I'm going to try to keep that in mind on this team as well.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing all that.
Yeah, for sure. And like you were kind of saying, maybe in a couple months we'll have a similar conversation and review and see how things went.
Yeah, we'll compare notes and see how each of our changes have panned out, and hopefully both for the positive, but lessons and learnings either way.
Yeah, well, thanks. And I mean, I gave you a bit of a grilling last time, so I think it's only fair that it was turned around a little bit.
There you go.
But as always, yeah, these are great conversations, and I appreciate the time. So thanks. And for those watching and listening, thanks for tuning in. Do us a favor, like, subscribe, and if you want to leave us a comment about what you thought about this episode or other things you want to hear us chat through, that'd be awesome. So we'll see you next time.